individual landlords becoming carbon neutral don't make a massive difference. The industry becoming carbon neutral makes a huge difference. The similarities between a public health crisis and the climate crisis are in some ways uncanny. The timelines are quite different, but the dynamics are very similar.
Brendan, even though it has to be said, a lot of real estate CEOs do not believe in climate change. This is just the way it is.
And that may be true. I don't want to comment on the political beliefs of real estate CEOs.
It's not political, Brendan, right? It's not political. This is directly impacts the kind of response something like this would get. So it's not, I'm not talking politics.
I would agree with you. However, here's the dynamic that's happening right now, is that regardless of what you believe as a real estate CEO, whether you believe the climate crisis is happening or you believe climate change is happening or not, what's happening is that within your political jurisdictions, you have mayors that are increasingly green.
Yes.
And even though Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, many mayors are putting their cities right back in. New York did it. Los Angeles did it. And here's the dynamic. Just like we talked about with retail, you can't move a building. So it doesn't matter what your political beliefs are. If you're going to get taxed and you're going to get fined for not being carbon neutral or not meeting certain carbon neutrality standards, doesn't really matter. That's now an economic incentive. When you look at certain states, so if you look at an electoral map of the most red state, the most Republican state in the US, and you look at voting maps, you'll see a lot of red and you'll typically see blue dots over every city. And if you look at where most of the real estate value is concentrated in those cities, it tends to be in the blue dots. So oftentimes cities have green Democratic mayors. So regardless of the political beliefs of landlords, it doesn't really matter, because if their buildings exist in jurisdictions where climate change becomes an imperative, where carbon neutrality becomes an imperative, it just becomes an economic issue for them. And in some ways, that's what we should be looking the government to do, right? Government is in part, it exists to solve collective action problems.
And to make unpopular decisions as well, right?
Like, they're in the long-term interests of society. And I think we all know there's a different time horizon in the tenure of real estate CEOs and the tenure of the climate crisis. They are fundamentally different time horizons. Wherever sustainability kind of sits on the priority list of a real estate CEO, I said by 2025.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that timeline and whether that's been accelerated or has relatively stayed the same given what's just happened, where we've had a near shutdown of the economy for the last 8 weeks. So I wonder if, has that changed anything in your timeline for this and the momentum that something like this has?
I think in the short term, the number one focus for any real estate CEO should be and ought to be the response to the COVID crisis and the public health dynamics around that. So that should be number one, and I think it appropriately is. I think if we start to look a year, 2, 3 years out, if again, the conclusion a real estate CEO draws is that, oh, now I don't need to focus on sustainability, I don't think that's the right conclusion, right? I don't think that is a long-term conclusion. I don't think that's probably a long-term CEO. So I think sustainability falls into one of the top 3 priorities for every real estate CEO, certainly in the US and most likely in the entire Western world, within the next 24 to 36 months. And we are seeing it. We are seeing it on all sides, because these landlords are, this is being impressed on them from the many constituents of the real estate industry. It's coming from tenants, right? Certain tenants are saying you need to adhere to certain environmental criteria that are well beyond what you would do economically on your own.
It's coming from investors too. I think that's the really interesting thing. It's coming from investors in these funds.
It's coming from capital markets, and it's coming from debt and equity providers. It's also coming from the insurance industry, right? The insurance industry is saying, we'll give you lower rates for more climate resilient assets.
Fifth Wall has made some pretty significant investments in companies that are like Open Door. I'm thinking of Open Door right now, that is essentially has to give up its core business, or has had to give up its core business for the past few weeks. iBuying, I'm thinking of instant home buying, given the safety issues and all that. It's a really capital intensive business. I think going in, you knew that, profitability is a long road with a business like that. We've seen companies like Zillow, we've seen Realogy. A lot of the big established players have moved into this space as well. and now it's frozen. Tell us what you're thinking about on the open door front, on the iBuying front, suspension of sort of the core business.
So I want to be careful I don't want to comment on any portfolio company and its performance, but what I can comment on is the sector of iBuying and kind of how I think this changes it. And I think what's happened is that you do, as you appropriately put, have a freeze on activity. And I think that's obviously incredibly unfortunate. But I don't think this in any way undermines the need for an iBuying solution for consumers. I mean, when you kind of back up and you say, what is iBuying, right? Mm-hmm. You have the U.S. residential real estate market, which is the largest peer-to-peer market on earth, right? You have every end user, every occupier of a home, typically selling their home to another end user. It's just a gigantic peer-to-peer market. It's a gigantic eBay for homes, the most expensive asset most consumers ever purchase. And as a result, the information, the transparency, the speed of transactions are all suboptimal, right? You can get more information about what's the best kind of running stock to buy on Amazon than you can about the quality or the condition or the economic outlook of a home you're buying. So I think what iBuying is just philosophically, it's saying that we shouldn't just have a peer-to-peer market. We should have a C, consumer, to B, business market, and a B, business to consumer market, which is exactly the trade of how iBuying works. A consumer sells a home to Opendoor flips it, and ultimately sells it to another consumer. What that gives them is the ability to, one, capture data, provide transparency around a sale, right? So you just have a higher level of quality, a higher level of experience, because you're dealing with an institution that's in the business of constantly selling homes. It's in the business of providing a standardized quality to those homes. And I think on both sides, it's giving a security of close. Like right now, it takes, I think it's close to like 140 days to typically sell a home through a broker, right? That's a very long time. I don't know how long it is right now, but I'm guessing it's an indeterminate amount of time.
I get the argument behind it. I understand the bet that you made and why you made it and why you're relatively bullish about the sector. But I was more asking about whether it will be able to withstand a sustained shutdown, given how capital intensive it is, given the burn rate in a lot of these companies, given just the massive amounts of cash that have been redeployed to take this on. Can it sustain the 6-week, 8-week, maybe 12, 14-week sort of shutdown?
Yeah, and the short answer is I don't think anyone knows, right? That's the nature of startup investing. I think we're really optimistic about Opendoor in part because a lot of the demand for selling a home very quickly with a guaranteed price is driven by expediency on the consumer side and driven by a need for security, right? So at some point, Opendoor will start operations again. And when they start operations again, I think you'll have sellers that are thinking more pragmatically about, if I want to sell a home, do I really want to price optimize right now? Or do what I really want the security of guaranteed close on a time frame that works for me, to move my family, to get the equity out of my house, whatever my needs are, I want some security around that. The other thing that I think is really important to note is that while you do have a lot of iBuyers out there, right? And Zillow has obviously started a program. There's a lot of companies in the space. What matters is the quality of the institutional investors. And I think one of the things Opendoor pioneered was institutionalizing the capital markets for iBuying, right? So the quality of the lenders that are actually providing capital to enable them to buy homes more efficiently, right? And return capital to investors according to a certain return profile. Mm-hmm. They institutionalize that to an extent and to, I think, a level of integrity that just you hadn't seen in the space.
One of your Brendan, one of your partners, your co-founder Brad, comes from that background, right? Comes from that Invitation Homes. Am I right? Yeah, I think that's...
and Invitation Homes is in many ways the exact same story, right? Like with many people from 2010 to 2014 were buying single-family homes, and there was this cottage industry that emerged of local, regional buyers that were buying homes. What Invitation Homes figured out is how to do it institutionally with speed and scale. And I think if you look at the iBuying space, no company, to the extent Opendoor has figured out how to institutionally buy homes with speed in scale.
It's also their main event, which is both an opportunity, right, in terms of refining it to get it to the point where you're talking about, and a threat, because if that's all you do and you can't do it anymore, we've seen big layoffs at the company, for example. So it's both things. On a more positive note, I think one of your points, you said expediency, right? And I think people are just getting more open to the idea of virtual, just because they don't want anyone in the house going through everything. So virtual showings have become more of a thing in the past few weeks. We haven't really seen it at the very top of the market yet, but you are seeing it across many price sectors you wouldn't have thought would have been open to the idea of like a buyer saying, all right, give me a tour. I'll just take a virtual tour. There's companies like Matterport, some companies like that. I wonder what you think about, appraisals are being done virtually as well now. So just broader in the home buying process and its openness to virtual experiences.
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right? We're seeing an acceleration of those trends. I think in some ways it underscores why I think a company like Opendoor is really well positioned, which is if you're going to be buying a home virtually, right, you want to have trust in who you're buying it from. It's the same thing with e-commerce, right? I feel a lot more comfortable buying a pair of socks on Amazon than buying them from another person that's selling socks on eBay. It's just the nature of standardized information. And that relates to everything you mentioned, the virtualization of appraisals, the virtualization of tours, frankly, digitizing every aspect of the closing of a home transaction, insurance, title insurance, mortgage, notary, all of those things ought to be digitalized. It's hard for an individual seller to adopt all that. You don't need an individual seller of a home to become an expert on setting up a virtual tour, setting up a 3D tour, building relationships with every virtual transaction company out there. What I think this does, it underscores why we want a business, a company, to intermediate many of these transactions, because it provides a higher quality standard and a higher degree of trust to consumers. In some ways, this could be a dress rehearsal, right? The COVID-19 crisis and how terrible it is, right? The social, the economic, the human toll it's had could in many ways be a dress rehearsal for something we face that's far more virulent, right, in coming years. And so what I do feel optimistic about is that real estate owners are taking a far more proactive approach to how do we deal with this. And one of the mindset shifts that you will see is that landlords, I don't think, thought of themselves as micro mayors, in the sense that we know that our mayor is responsible for the well-being of the people in their jurisdiction, right? If they're drinking polluted water, that is the mayor's fault. That is the local political authority's fault. But if a building owner is not providing safe air or potentially contaminated air to their tenants, I don't think they internalized that responsibility previously to the extent that they could have or should have. And I think coming out of this crisis, landlords will see themselves as we have a responsibility to the well-being of our tenants that...
I don't think that's wildly optimistic, what you're saying about landlords reconceptualizing themselves as more than owning an asset. I mean, and you're talking about institutional landlords or all landlords?
I think it will start with institutional landlords because they have to. But no, I don't. And I would say just in the conversations, I've had conversations with many of our 54 real estate company CEOs in the last 2 months. And I would say the gravity of their social responsibility has dawned on them, and the importance of protecting their tenants, not just with respect to the elements, right? Protecting your tenants from rain or snow or cold air is always how real estate has conceptualized itself. But now we're protecting it against microbes, right? And we're protecting the well-being of tenants around things we had never previously conceptualized as falling into our responsibility as landlords. And I think landlords are saying, we need to internalize that. And by the way, I do think a big part of the solution will be technology. I actually did a conversation with Wallace recently. And all of what we talked about was, how can you make buildings safer for tenants and for occupants? And there's a lot that you can do, and a lot of it relates to technology. And I think it prompts really existential questions about what it means to be a landlord. And what I think it starts to collapse is the distinction between just a transactional relationship with your tenants and having a social and a health imperative to protect them, which is very much like being a micro mayor, right? It's you have jurisdiction over your assets.